I saw in a sikha that Rebbe encourages to learn about Shmitah, particularly during Elul, preceding Shmitah. And that is because there are aspects of Shmitah which already become applicable for the farmer already in Elul. So there are certain pruning, whatever it may be, which the farmer would not be allowed to do already in Shmitah, in Elul. And on that basis, the Rebbe says, so when we should be learning about Shmitah already now. So let's go. The word Shmitah means to let slip, to waive. And with what's more applicable in Chutz La'aretz, outside Eretz Yisrael, is the waiving of debts, which is called Shmitas Kasopim, letting monetary debts go. Then, but what's more dramatic in Eretz Yisrael is obviously the Shmitas Karkois, which means any agricultural work is not up, it doesn't happen. Anything which to propagate growth, etc. If you were in Eretz Yisrael, you would be allowed to, well, if you had a lawn, you wouldn't be allowed to water it to make it grow better, but you would be allowed to water it that it shouldn't die away. So there's a certain degree of maintenance which is allowed, but propagating is not allowed. We're going to go into much more detail than that. So before dealing with the agricultural side, let's just deal with the money side. And that is that the Eibishter, Hashem gave us a mitzvah that when it comes every year by Shmitah, every seventh year, if someone owes you money, you should be ready to waive the debt. And this was obviously to benefit the poorer people who may have borrowed to try to do some business endeavor, and it didn't work out. They thought they would have the money to pay back, and it didn't work out. So now, not only did they not succeed, but now they're landed with debts also. So Hashem gave us the mitzvah that once in 7 years, there should be an amnesty, that the debts are cancelled. Torah also says very clearly that one shouldn't have a negative thought to say, oh, Shmitah is around the corner, and I'm not going to give a debt. I give a loan if I'm going to have to waive the debt. So Hashem says that you shouldn't have this thought. And for hundreds of years, Yidden were living in Eretz Yisrael, and they kept Shmitah. And it looks like the lending was going on, and it came to Shmitah, people would waive the debt, and it went on. In the times of the second Beis HaMikdash, it was observed that when it came closer to Shmitah, poorer people weren't able to borrow. There are all different excuses, perhaps. Money's tied up here, there's that, maybe, whatever it was, that this waiver, the Shmitah waiver of debts, which was there to protect the poor people, was actually now backfiring. It was making them unable to get loans to be able to do anything. And so I'm explaining this because we've got what's called the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. So the letter of the law is that you have to waive debts. But the spirit of the law is in order to benefit, that the poor people should be able to borrow money and not be landed with a debt which they can't pay. So Hillel, of famous Hillel and Shammai, so Hillel, he instituted a procedure, method, how lenders could lend money to the poor and not be worried about having to waive the debt when it comes to Shmitah. What he did was, he says, look at the pasuk carefully. We're not allowed, we have a personal debt, we have a duty to waive. What if the debt is not a personal one? It's a debt to a Beis Din. So a debt to a Beis Din does not get waived at Shmitah. So what he says is, Hillel said, you know what? It comes close to Shmitah. Transfer any debts which you're owed. Transfer those debts to the Beis Din. In that way, it's the Beis Din who have the ability to collect them. And although practically you will collect them, but you will be collecting them on behalf of Beis Din. This is a kind of clause which he introduced. The full word term is peruz bule ubuti, as you have on your screen, which means a clause for the wealthy and for the poor. And for short, it became peruz bul, the clause for the poor. And that's what we will do before Rosh Hashanah this year. In many communities, they do it at the end of Shmitah. So we will say to a Beis Din of 3 people, I am transferring all the debts which I'm owed, and I'm transferring to the Beis Din so that they should be collectible at any later date. It's written actually in the Machzer, in the annotated Machzer on page 4, because on Erev Rosh Hashanah, in the morning after davening, it's a custom for the Hatoros Nedorim, for the men to sit around the table to absolve vows which they may have made during the year. And so when it comes to this year, we'll also add the extra line that I'm transferring to the Beis Din all debts which are owed to me, and that I should be allowed to collect them at any later date. Okay, let's now go on to some of the agricultural side of Shmitah halachas. So the mitzvah of Shmitah is to leave your produce free for anyone to take. It also, the mitzvah of Shmitah gives a certain kedusha. It says that the fruit of Shmitah have a certain kedusha, a certain holiness, and we're going to deal with that soon. Meanwhile, let's make it clear that there's 2 main groups of produce, and they are fruit from trees or fruit which grow from the ground. Now, this is very, very important, because if you go to the supermarket and you pick up a packet of radishes, could be they'll come from Eretz Yisrael, sometimes it says on them, or you'll pick up a packet of avocado, which is very commonly sourced from Eretz Yisrael, and it says on the packet. So at this moment, neither of them are going to be from Shmitah. What would happen if it would be Erev Sukkot and you pick up some Israeli produce and you don't know, is it Shmitah or is it not Shmitah? So I wanted this, at this point, clarify that there's a difference between fruit of trees and vegetables which grow from the ground. And that is that fruit of trees, their status depends on when the fruit began to blossom. And therefore, an avocado which will be picked, let's say, Sukkot time, Cheshvan, that avocado started blossoming still in this year, Tafshin Pei Aleph. Therefore, the avocados which you will see in the winter, even if they are from Eretz Yisrael, they will not have the status of Shmitah because they began growing, the blossoming happened in the preceding year. So in winter, earlier part of which winter, Tafshin Pei Beis, avocados will not have a problem of Shmitah. But it will come to Tafshin Pei Gimel, 2 years' time. Then, yes, then the fruit in the earlier part of the year, Israeli fruit, will have the status of Shmitah. So that is as far as fruit of trees. By contrast, vegetables, their status of being Shmitah is defined on when they were picked. So if, let's say, you go to the supermarket, Chalamoid Sukkos, and you buy a packet of radishes, they're from Israel, presumably, I don't know the facts, but let's say they were picked within the last 2 weeks. So they've got Kedushas Shvius because they were picked once it was ready Shmitah, assuming that they grew normally from the ground, etc. All right, so that's very important for you to know whether the produce which you picked up doesn't have Kedushas Shvius or not, and this will depend on whether it's a vegetable or it's a fruit of a tree. What are you meant to do with it? Okay, so let's see what we have on the next slide. Okay, so the truth is that Kedushas HaPeiros, the sanctity of the fruit of Shmitah, means that you are, we have on this slide, the Torah says, L'ochlo, the fruit of Shmitah are there for eating. L'ochlo, as we say, v'lo lehefsid, l'ochlo v'lo l'schayr. L'ochlo, to be eaten and not to be traded with. So trade with Shmitah produce is forbidden. That's why we wouldn't consciously buy Shmitah produce, avocados, let's say. I wouldn't buy them consciously because in that way, perhaps as a customer, I'm not called a trader, but I'm certainly supporting the endeavor of trading with Shmitah fruit, which shouldn't be done. So we shouldn't buy them, and certainly a Jewish trader should not be marketing for Shmitah fruit. The other aspect of Kedushas Shvius is v'lo lehefsid, not to waste it. Now, if you are living in Eretz Yisrael and you are a user, a consumer of Shmitah produce, which is legitimate, you have a restriction not to waste. So if you peel potatoes, so the potato peels are also edible. So if they are Shmitah peels, you don't put them in a bin, you have a separate bin just for Shmitah peels. You peel an orange. Those peels are edible to a degree. So those peels don't go in the bin together with the chicken bones or whatever it may be. The peels of the orange will go into this little caddy, which you'll have specifically for Shmitah, so-called edible food. Any waste, okay. Also, you serve food, and at the end of the meal, sometimes some people are finicky; they don't eat everything. So that left over, you wouldn't put it in the bin. If it's Shmitah fruit, it has to be put in a separate place. And what happens then? What happens with this caddy? Well, we won't directly destroy it. Instead, we'll leave it to decompose. So we put it in this thing, and then it's going to take, nature will take its course, but we don't actively spoil it. One cute application of this is that if you had wine of Shmitah, you would have a problem with using it for Havdalah, because Havdalah, we put the candle inside the wax. Sorry, inside the wine. We extinguish the candle with the wine, and that makes that wine inedible. So if you wouldn't put out your Havdalah candle with Shmitah wine. I don't remember. I believe I was in Eretz Yisrael for Shmitah more than once. What about, let's say, when you make Kiddush and you have the wine spills over into the plate? So again, that would be also an issue of not to waste it. So so then what I'm saying here at this point is that you've got, let's say you did buy Shmitah fruit. Okay, it came your way. So even if you are allowed to eat it, assuming that you are allowed to eat it, so then you be careful not to waste it. So that's the la'ochlo v'lo lehefsid. Okay, let's come back. In Eretz Yisrael, this becomes a much bigger issue, and that is the following. The difference between fruit of a tree and fruit of the produce of the ground is that trees naturally produce fruit year in, year out. Vegetables, by contrast, need to be replanted every year. Now, perhaps you've ever had strawberries growing in your garden, perhaps you planted, and you come back next year, you didn't plant, but some grew. It can sometimes be from a bit of windfalls, etc. So there can be a little bit of regrowth. That can happen with vegetables. They can manage without people also. Yeah, but not such a good growth, but there can be a little bit of regrowth. Now, what the Chachamim saw in going back in the times of the Mishnah, that the farmers was having a lot of sfichin, a lot of stuff which grew by itself, quote unquote. It was so much that it was obviously a sham, and they were actually planting vegetables on the quiet. And if they were challenged, they said it grew by itself. And this seemed to have been such a big problem that the Chachamim made a, if I may say, a draconian decree that no sfichin are permitted, which means that that any vegetables growing in the year of Shmitah are, even if they grew by themselves, are not permitted. So if any of you have been in Israel and you know what a typical Israeli breakfast is, it's all right. So you have a chavita, for a fried egg perhaps, and a leben, a yogurt. But then it's typically going to be some cucumbers, tomatoes, and peppers. Now, you have a population of millions of Yidden, Baruch Hashem, Ken Yirbu, and what we're telling them is, sorry, there's no cucumbers for the next year. Any cucumbers which grow by themselves, sorry, you can't eat them. So, first of all, if they don't replant them, there's obviously going to be a shortage. But even if they grew by themselves, they're also not okay. So this is important for us to know that whereas, let's say, the radishes which you may pick up in the supermarket during Sukkot, they will not have a problem of sfichin because they were actually planted in before Shmitah. But let's say in the summer, 7, 8 months time, 9 months time, and you buy some vegetables, some radishes from Eretz Yisrael, so not only do they have kedushas shvius, but actually you're not allowed to eat them. Like in Eretz Yisrael itself, they wouldn't be allowed to eat them because of the issue of sfichin. So to make this clear, fruit of trees which come from Eretz Yisrael may be eaten and be dealt with kedushas shvius. Vegetables which grow in Eretz Yisrael in violation of Shmitah, those vegetables may not be eaten at all. Now, what do you do with them? Well, putting them in the bin is the last thing you should do, because as we said, so we're not allowed to destroy them, but you'd have to leave them to decompose. So now let's talk about the practical question, not so relevant for us, but for the community in Eretz Yisrael. What do all of these millions of Yidden, Ken Yirbu, what do they do for provision of vegetables? Fruit is not such a problem. The fruit is growing by itself. What about the vegetables which they cannot produce? So one of this is a problem which has been going on for, well, more pronouncedly in the last 150 years since there's been a return of Yidden en masse to Eretz Yisrael. So one of these sources, which is free from the restrictions of Shmitah to a degree, is Yevul Nachri, produce of a non-Jew. So Here it becomes an interesting question. If a non-Jew owns land in Eretz Israel, we know land in Eretz Israel has got a sanctity, a kedusha, and therefore it's subject to truma and meiser. What about if it's owned by a non-Jew? So this is a discussion in Gemara. Im yesh kinyan lenochri lahafkia. Eretz Israel, does a goy have a power to acquire land in Eretz Israel to the degree that it becomes exempt from trumas and maestras? The general view is no, that even if a goy does own land, it is still, if we buy that produce, we still have to take truma and meiser. But here is a different issue. Here, we're talking about a penalty. We're talking about the issue of sfichin that Chacham said, because we don't want you to, on the quiet, to be planting vegetables, therefore vegetables are banned. That is applicable for Yidden. For non-Jews, they're allowed to work the soil. There's no avera on them to work the soil. So as a result, the Yevul Nochri, the produce of Eretz Israel, produced by non-Jewish farmers, is a heter, is permitted. The other option, which is the bone of contention between, should we say, the Datiyim and the Charedim, is selling the land. Can I, like we know we can sell chometz to a goy, can I sell my field to a goy? And then it takes it out of the kedusha sa'oretz, and I can work the land because it's not Eretz Yisrael, because it belongs to a goy. This is a very controversial method. As I say, the Dati Leumi, Mizrahi, etc., that a community generally do allow heter mechira, whereas the more Haredi element is quite opposed to heter mechira, saying it doesn't work because it still remains kedusha sa'aretz, and you can't sell whatever it is. The heter mechira is something which we would not subscribe to. But coming back to Yevul Nachri, okay. So now, this is a big source for produce in Eretz Yisrael, vegetables from Goyisha owned lands. So until the Intifada, first Intifada 20 odd years ago, so one of the big sources for vegetables was from Gaza. The problem was, however, that if there was a non-religious farmer, a Jewish non-religious farmer, somewhere else in Eretz Yisrael, and he's producing tomatoes, he can't sell them because they're Shmitah stuff. So he would then drive down his truck full of tomatoes, drive down to Gaza, sell them to Ahmed. Ahmed would then sell them from customers. And they would, and so that became a problem that we can't trust. When Ahmed sells you tomatoes, he says they're from his own field. We can't trust him, and therefore we have to be concerned that we have to have a mashgiach. We have to have a mashgiach go down to the field, to Ahmed's field, and to see as he's picking this fruit, these tomatoes. Then we know that these tomatoes indeed grew in Ahmed's land. Okay. This was possible until the Intifada. Due to the Intifada, it became dangerous for the mashgichim, for the Jewish supervisors, to go down to the fields in Gaza, and as a result, that became that avenue of Shmitah free vegetables, if that's the right term, became closed. So that cutoff has a very significant supply of vegetables to Eretz Yisrael during Shmitah. There are a couple of other avenues. One is what's called hydroponics, and that is vegetables which are not grown in the soil, but on beds of cotton wool and things like that, where it's grown on water without being attached to the soil. That does not become does not have kedushas haaretz, doesn't give the fruit kedushas shvius. So that's another big source. And actually, many vegetables grow very well on hydroponics systems. So that remains a large avenue for sourcing Shmitah-free products. Another option is just south of the border. South of the border of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Now, as we read in the Torah, Torah describes the borders of Eretz Yisrael. The southern border of Eretz Yisrael would be somewhat south of Beersheba. As you may be familiar with the map of Israel, it kind of south of Beersheba then goes like the triangle, the bottom of which is Eilat. So that triangle is exactly where the line is drawn is a subject of debate, but there is this large area, I think it's called the Arava, which is it's part of the state of Israel, but it's not, doesn't have Kedushas Haaretz, doesn't have Eretz Yisrael halacha, and any produce grown there, it does not have Kedushas Shvius. And although naturally it's quite arid over there, but Baruch Hashem, people of the Eibishter gave the chokhmah to people how to develop irrigation systems to be able to produce, and there's a lot of growing down there in the Arava. So that's another source of non-Shmitah or non-Sfichin vegetables during the year of Shmitah. And of course, there's a possibility of import from out of Eretz Yisrael, although normally Eretz Yisrael, as far as vegetables, etc., is quite self-sufficient. But in the year of Shmitah, there's going to have to be a degree of importing also, which actually makes things also another interesting point there. If the non-frum farmers cannot market their goods adequately in Eretz Yisrael, the likelihood of it going to Chutz La'aretz becomes so much greater in the year of Shmitah than in any other year. So there's going to be more Israeli produce in the European markets during the year of Shmitah, predictably, more so than during a regular year, because the stuff can't be sold locally, so that it's going to probably go to export. Okay, let's move on. We did this already. Okay. The Torah says that the fruit of Shmitah should be left out in the fields, and you're allowed to have a little bit at home, so long as it's still hefker out in the fields. If that food is no longer available in the field, at that point, we have to make the stuff in our larders also hefker. So when what's going to happen is there's a calendar of Zman HaBiur, of a list of all different types of fruit, of apricots and then of plums and of grapes and then of peaches, etc. At what stage are they going to be obsolete out in the fields? And at which stage we would have a duty to make them hefker, whatever we have in supply at home. I don't know how much this is applicable in Chutz La'aretz, but this is going to be particularly going into Tovshin Pei Gimel. There will be lists published in the press. But this is the Zman HaBiur for this fruit. This is the Zman HaBiur for that fruit. But probably most likely for us, maybe things like wine. Generally, I've never seen Shmitah wine with a Haredi hechsher. There are hechsherim on Shmitah wine also, but if you did have Shmitah fruit and it becomes this Zman HaBiur, you'd have to put it out hefker, and then if no one else claims it, you can take it back. So there are those who, on this basis, they say that an esrig brought from Eretz Yisrael should not be, well, they say that you'd have to send it back to Eretz Yisrael to be able to make it hefker over there. Okay, if you're buying an Israeli esrog, you have to speak to your dealer. What they're doing about it? Are they taking them back or not? That's a discussion you'll speak to your esrog dealer. Right. Now, let's discuss another reality in Eretz Yisrael. You've got hundreds of thousands of Yidden living in Bnei Brak, in Shalim, from a Yidden, and many other places. But think about this. There are fields where there's produce growing, where there's orchards. Imagine if every Sunday there's going to be a bus or buses going out from Bnei Brak towards the orchards, and each housewife is going to take her basket and go along to the trees and start picking the fruit. It's you can imagine the logistics and the absolute chaos which this would bring about. So in order to make life more manageable, there is a system called Oitzer Be'estin, and in which, let's say I've got an orchard of oranges. So instead of having people traipsing through my orchard, I make an agreement with the Be'estin that my oranges are available free of charge. Be'estin will send people to pick them, put them in crates. They might be the same workers who worked for me last year. So Be'estin will employ those people to pick the fruit, to crate them, to transport them, and then Be'estin will sell them, not for the price of the fruit itself, because the fruit is free of charge. Be'estin will charge for the logistics, the transportation and the picking. All of these things are permitted activities of Shmitah. They also cost money. So Be'estin will be, that's the system. So to a degree, now going back more to Preyos Ha'ilon, fruits, apples, or whatever it may be, avocados growing during the Shmitah year do have Kedushas Shvius. So Be'estin will sell them. They're not selling their fruit. They're just, because they give, actually the fruit was free. They're just charging for the logistics which are involved in getting it out to be available for the customer. Once you take those fruit home, they do have Kedushas Shvius, and you'd have to deal with the peels, etc., as we said before. And right. Did that already just discuss that? Okay. Since we're already talking about fruit from Eretz Yisrael, a very important point. I said about avocados from Eretz Yisrael. The first 3 years, this is not relevant to Shmitah specifically, it's relevant to every year. The first 3 years of a fruit tree, the fruit is forbidden for us to have benefit of. It's also b'hanoah. Worse than chazer. Chazer is also b'achila, and orlo is also b'hanoah, not to have benefit from it. You might think it's not such a big problem, because anyone who has a fruit tree, who's planted a fruit tree, knows that the first few years it doesn't really grow much fruit. The fact is, however, that commercially they don't usually grow fruit trees from seeds. Usually they take cuttings of existing trees, put them in water, and then they start developing roots. Then they put them in little plant pots in a nursery, and they gradually become a bit more sturdy. And then there's another stage. Then let's say then they put them outdoors, still in a protected environment for 2 years. Once they're 2 years old, then they'll take them and plant them out in the orchards. Still need more. They're still quite tender, but okay. Now, you look at this tree and you think, oh, it's 3 years old. It looks 3 years old, 4 years old. Now, Halacha may say, wait a minute. When it was disconnected from the ground, it's like its clock has been turned to day one. In other words, replanting makes it start. The clock starts again, and you have to start Shmitah. I'm sorry, Orlo count the first 3 years of Orlo. 3 years of Orlo count from when it was replanted. Now, things like oranges and things is not a big issue. There's not such a large amount of replanting. But trees which are more tender and do require a lot of replanting, so there's going to be a high incident of Orlo. So something like grapes, I understand, there's a lot of replanting, and therefore there's a lot of Orlo. So when we say about fruit from Eretz Yisrael, that it's okay to, if it's before Shmitah or during Shmitah, but if it's from the first 3 years, so then that fruit is a problem of Orla, which we're not allowed to eat. So things like grapes from Eretz Yisrael, I would, the way I understand it, it's one should avoid using them altogether, because there's no way you can verify they're not from the first 3 years. Now, clarify something. The halacha is that Orla applies in Chutz La'aretz also. But the halacha is that Sofik Orla in Chutz La'aretz is permitted. So when I've got grapes from Spain and tangerines from Morocco, I don't have to worry about this business of Orla, because Sofik Orla in Chutz La'aretz is permitted. But Eretz Yisrael, Sofik Orla is forbidden. So therefore, grapes, as I say, an example, grapes from Eretz Yisrael is going to be Sofik Orla, and one should avoid them. And just the logistics, which I mentioned before, if the non-frum farmer can't sell Orla in Eretz Yisrael, so let's say grapes, let's say 5% of our grapes produced in Eretz Yisrael, let's say 2%, doesn't matter. So the 2% of grapes is Orla. Okay. But then, when it comes to export, since that 2% can't be sold locally because somebody from Yidden won't touch it, and they know that it has to have a hechsher and all that, so then it's going to go to export, unless the people are from farmers. Otherwise, if they're not from, so then they're not going to do it. Wait, we'll send it into the bin, so they're going to send it to export. So therefore, the proportion of Orla in exported fruit is going to be so much more significant. And as a result, anything which has a concern of Orla, likelihood of Orla, one shouldn't be using from Paris Haaretz. I'll just perhaps finish off with a beautiful thought. There is the halacha is, if you have a tree, and it's a big fruit tree, and then around it, there's growing up little trees, little saplings. And they are obviously satellites from the mother tree. So the halacha is that those trees are, the fruit is permitted, so long as they are attached to the mother tree. Like in the olden days, as in 40 years ago, children could travel on their parents' passports, I believe. So, but then, as time goes on, the satellite trees will become independent trees. At that point, they will suddenly become newborns in halacha, and 3 years of Orla will apply. And so the Gemara, the Yerushalmi, there's not the mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael with the agriculture are discussed much more in the Yerushalmi than in Bavli, perhaps for obvious reasons, that this was the Bavli written in Bovel and Yerushalmi written in Eretz Yisrael. At any rate, the Yerushalmi talks about this. How am I meant to know? I've got here a big old tree, and I've got small little trees around them. And how am I meant to know when they are still satellites of the mother tree and when they become independent of the mother tree? It's a fascinating thing. So long as they are dependent of the mother tree, they will be looking away. Their leaves will be gravitating away from the mother tree. And Yerushalmi says that because they are dependent on the mother tree, they are embarrassed to look the mother in the face. So they're looking away. Once they become independent, then they start. They gravitate in all directions, like a normal tree. It gravitates in all directions. It radiates in all directions. On a simple level, you have everything's got a tree has got a nucleus, and it's spreading out. It's radiating. When they are satellites, so their nucleus is the mother tree. When they become independent, so their nucleus is their own trunk, and therefore they start spreading in all directions. But meanwhile, the Yerushalmi says this beautiful idea, this thought, that when they are dependent, so then they are embarrassed looking at the mother tree, which is an understanding in chinuch and understanding human behavior. You sometimes find people helping them so much, and they resent this, they're complaining about this, complaining about that. And the psychology is that, should we say, dependence breeds resentment. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't help them, but just bear that in mind, that the fact that they are dependent upon you actually would cause a certain degree of resentment. And that's why we sometimes will see children complaining about this, complaining about that. But the reassurance is that you're going to help them grow to the point that they're going to become independent. At that time, once they become independent, they will look back, they will reflect on where they originated from, and what supported them who supported them until they became independent. And hopefully they will look back in appreciation and say thank you for all you've done for them in all these years. Okay, that's this thought which I wanted to share with you, and I wish you a good afternoon, and Shmitah, Shona Tova.